Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today, we're looking at a really interesting pair of emotions in Buddhism. We're going to be talking about 𝙀𝙢𝙖𝙞𝙀 and pasada.
Yeah, and I think most people listening probably recognize pasada, serenity, clarity, peace, those kind of feelings. But 𝙀𝙀𝙖𝙀...
Yeah, not so much, right? I mean, anxiety. What's that got to do with Buddhism?
Well, and that's where it gets really interesting, because our source this week, Pasted Text, Noble Strategy, makes the argument that these two are actually foundational to Buddhist practice.
So it's like almost like this idea that you don't get to that place of serenity and peace and clarity without first confronting the difficult stuff.
Exactly. It's like a journey and you've got to begin somewhere. And 𝙀𝙀𝙖𝙀, that anxiety, that kind of existential dread, is actually the wake-up call that gets us on the path towards pasada.
Okay, that's a really interesting way to think about it. So where do we even begin?
Well, I think a good place to start is with the story of the Buddha himself. You know Prince Siddhartha. He was born into this life of incredible luxury, never saw any suffering, and then...
Right. Yeah. He encounters an old person, a sick person, and then a dead person.
Right, like one after another. Bam, bam, bam. And for him, this is just... It's mind-blowing. It completely shatters his worldview.
And it's not just like an intellectual, oh, that's interesting. This is deep, visceral, emotional experience.
Right, and the Buddhist poet 𝙀𝙀𝙖𝙀 really captures that in his writing. The prince is terrified. He's completely disillusioned with all the pleasures he's always known. And it's that feeling of like, wait, is this all there is?
Wow, that's a far cry from those serene Buddhist statues we see everywhere.
Yeah, but it's important to understand that's the starting point, right? And what's interesting is the king, Siddhartha's father, tries to kind of smooth things over, distract him. He throws more luxury and entertainment his way, basically anything to avoid him having to face those tough feelings.
It's so relatable, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of how we deal with discomfort in modern life. Just pile on more distraction.
Yeah, totally. Shopping sprees, social media binges, you name it. But Siddhartha, he can't just ignore this deep anxiety.
Thank goodness for that.
Yeah. And I think that's a really powerful message for us today. When we have those moments of feeling unsettled, feeling that kind of existential unease, that's 𝙀𝙀𝙀 trying to tell us something important. It might be saying, hey, you're sleepwalking through life. You're ignoring the big questions. Yeah. You need to wake up.
Okay, I'm getting chills because I've definitely felt that before. So instead of pushing it down, what do we do with it? What do we do with 𝙀𝙀𝙀?
Well, the text breaks it down into three sort of feeling clusters. First, there's that disillusionment, the feeling of like, what's the point? Everything's temporary.
Right.
Second, there's the guilt, like, have I been wasting time? Have I been ignoring what truly matters? And then finally, there's this urgency, the feeling of, I need to find a way out. There's got to be a better way, a more meaningful way to live.
Okay, wow. Yeah, I can really see why 𝙀𝙀𝙀 is seen as such a crucial part of the path. It's like that initial push that gets you going. But how do we get from that to pasada? How do we go from the anxiety to the serenity?
Well, let's go back to the prince. So after he leaves the palace, he encounters a wandering forest contemplative. And this figure is kind of representing somebody who's living a simple, purposeful life guided by wisdom.
So it's not just about feeling serene. There's this clarity and confidence that comes from understanding.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where the Buddhist teachings on suffering come in. Pasada arises from actually understanding, really grasping the Four Noble Truths. The truth of suffering, the cause of suffering, the possibility of ending suffering, and then the path to actually do it.
Okay, so it's not just blind faith. There's a very clear understanding here of how things work and that there's a way to break free from that cycle of suffering.
You got it. And it's really empowering because you realize, hey, I'm not just a victim here. I have the power to walk this path. But what's interesting is the prince's encounter with this contemplative, it's not the end of his journey. He still has to go and figure things out for himself.
That's a good point. It's like seeing pasada embodied in another person can inspire us, but we still have to do the work ourselves.
Exactly. So we have 𝙀𝙀𝙀𝙀, this urgent push out of complacency, and we have pasada, this deep sense of peace that comes from understanding. But how do we cultivate these things? How do we actually bring them into our lives?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's a perfect segue into our next section. We're going to explore exactly how Buddhism goes about cultivating both of these seemingly contradictory emotions. So we've established that 𝙀𝙀𝙀𝙀, that anxiety about life's impermanence, is actually a positive thing in Buddhism. It's kind of like the fuel, right?
Yeah, it kickstarts the juice.
Gets you going.
Yeah.
But then how do we actually cultivate it? Because it seems a little counterintuitive. Like, shouldn't we want to feel less anxious, not more?
Well, you'd think so, right? But the path to liberation takes serious effort and dedication. And it's so easy to get distracted. It's so easy to get caught up in the comfort and complacency of just everyday life.
Oh yeah, tell me about it.
So Buddhism actually uses Savaka as a reminder to keep us focused on what's truly important. By reflecting on those difficult truths, like death or the fact that everything changes, we kind of keep that fire of Savaka burning.
This is like a nudge, like, hey, remember that existential dread you felt? Let's not go back there.
Exactly.
Hey, I get that. Sometimes we need a little discomfort to motivate us to grow. But how does pasada fit into all of this?
Pasada is kind of like the fruit of understanding and practice. It's not something you force. It just emerges naturally as you delve deeper into those Four Noble Truths we were talking about.
Could you give me an example of that? How does understanding those truths actually lead to that sense of pasada?
Sure. So the first noble truth is acknowledging that suffering exists, right? But the second noble truth goes a step further, and it explains the cause of that suffering. And that is our clinging, our grasping to things that are impermanent. That's what ultimately causes us pain.
Yeah, I see that. Like the more we attach to things that we can't control, the more we're setting ourselves up for disappointment and heartache.
Absolutely. And that's where the third noble truth comes in the possibility of actually ending suffering. And just that realization, that glimmer of hope is where we start to see pasada emerge.
It's like seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, knowing that we don't have to be stuck in that cycle of suffering.
Right. And then finally, the fourth noble truth lays out the actual steps that we can take to cultivate that liberation. And that is the path. It's about developing wisdom and compassion and living ethically. And as we walk that path, pasada grows, and it provides us with clarity, stability, and a sense of peace.
So Savaka kind of shakes us awake. The Four Noble Truths lead us to that understanding, and pasada is that result. It's like going from fear and anxiety to this place of deep peace. But not everybody becomes a monk or a nun. How can everyday people integrate these ideas into their lives?
That's where the Sangha comes in, the Buddhist community. And it's made up of two branches. The monastic community, the folks who dedicate their lives to the practice, and then the lay community, people who are integrating the teachings into their daily lives.
So there are different levels of engagement, right? You can go all in with monasticism, or you can find ways to apply the principles while still living in the world.
Exactly. And these two branches support each other. The monastics provide guidance and inspiration, and the lay followers offer material support, and they help to ground the teachings in real-world experience.
I love that. It's a two-way street. But even if somebody isn't Buddhist, what can they take away from this?
I think the concept of intentionally cultivating Savaka is so valuable regardless of your beliefs. It's about using that discomfort as a springboard for positive change. Instead of just trying to numb ourselves out, ask, what is this unease trying to tell me? What needs to shift in my life?
Ooh, that is a powerful question to ask. And it seems like finding a supportive community, even a small one, could be really helpful for navigating those big questions and working towards pasada.
Absolutely. We don't have to do this alone. And remember, pasada isn't just about feeling serene. It's about that clarity and confidence that arises from understanding. It's like, okay, I see the challenge, but I also see the way forward. I have a map and I know where I'm going.
I like that a lot. So we talked about Savaka as the catalyst, the Four Noble Truths as the path, and pasada as that kind of the goal or the result. But how does that translate into actionable steps for the listener? What can they actually do?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's a perfect place to wrap up our dive. We're going to explore how to put these concepts into practice in everyday life.
All right, so we spent this whole deep dive talking about these kind of like opposite emotions, Savaka, that anxiety, and pasada, that serenity, that peace, that clarity, and how they actually kind of work together on the Buddhist path.
Yeah, and I think what's so striking is that Buddhism doesn't shy away from the hard stuff, right? It actually encourages us to confront the difficulties of life head on.
It's like instead of offering us a Band-Aid, it's saying, let's look at the wound. Let's understand what's going on here. And it acknowledges that impermanence, that everything changes, the suffering that comes from clinging to things that we can't control.
Exactly. But it doesn't just leave us there wallowing in despair. That's where pasada comes in, right? It's that feeling of like, okay, I see the storm, I see the waves crashing, but I also see the lighthouse that's going to guide me home.
And that safe harbor, that sense of peace and understanding, it comes from walking that path, the path laid out in those Four Noble Truths, right?
Right. It's not about denial. It's not about escaping. It's about understanding the nature of suffering, understanding the causes of suffering, and the possibility of actually being free from suffering, and then taking action. It's about cultivating wisdom and compassion and living ethically.
Yeah. We talked about the Sangha, that supportive community of monastics and lay people. But what if you're not Buddhist? Can these concepts still be helpful for just anybody?
Oh, absolutely. I think the beauty of these teachings is that they're universal. You don't have to join a monastery. You don't even have to identify as Buddhist to benefit from them.
Okay, so how can we, the listeners, take these ancient ideas and actually apply them to our lives today? How can we start doing that?
I think the first step is just noticing. Pay attention to when you're actually experiencing sabbha. It might be a big life event that triggers it, Or sometimes it's just a subtle feeling of unease or discontent.
Like that feeling of, is this all there is? Or like you said, that urgency to find more meaning in your life.
Exactly. And instead of ignoring it, instead of pushing those feelings away, lean into them. Ask yourself, what is this trying to show me? What needs to change?
Okay, so it's not about dwelling in the anxiety, but using it as like a springboard for growth. It's like saying, okay, this is uncomfortable, but this discomfort is pointing me towards something important.
You got it. And remember, cultivating pasada is a process. It's not something that happens overnight. It takes practice, and it helps to have support. Find a community, whether it's a meditation group, a book club, even just a couple of close friends that can help you explore these ideas and support you on your journey.
And what about those small everyday actions we talked about, like mindfulness, meditation, even just spending time in nature? Can those things help too?
Absolutely. It's like planting little seeds of peace and clarity in your mind. And over time, with nurturing, they'll grow into a sense of well-being and resilience that you can really rely on.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into sabbha and pasada, I want to leave you with this thought. The path to a more fulfilling life, it's not about ignoring the difficult stuff. It's about facing it with courage and understanding and embracing the journey with all its ups and downs.
And remember, you're not alone. There are resources, there are communities, and there are practices that can help you navigate the challenges and cultivate a deeper sense of peace and purpose in your life.
Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful, and we hope it's given you some inspiration for your own journey. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.